This is the full story of how General Sani Abacha, the Secretary of Defense, overthrew Chief Ernest Shonekan, the head of the interim national government of Nigeria, on November 17, 1993. The Sani Abacha coup of November 17, 1993 happened quickly and in broad daylight. All relevant military units and conspirators in Lagos, Abuja and Kaduna were quietly placed on alert. Under protective cover provided by a detachment of the National Guard led by Colonel Lawan Gwadabe, three very senior officers, motivated by different instincts and with no consensus on what would happen thereafter, flew to Abuja from Lagos. They calmly walked into Shonekan's office at the presidential villa and asked that he resign. These officers were General Sani Abacha, Secretary of Defense, Lieutenant General Oladipo Diya, Chief of Defense Staff, and Lieutenant General Aliyu Mohammed Gusau, Chief of Army Staff. Ernest Shonekan, the former United African Company executive, never had operational control of the armed forces during his controversial tenure. He wisely chose not to resist. Interestingly, the Chief of Army Staff, Aliyu Mohammed Gusau, was said to be a personal friend of Shonekan and reportedly played games with him from time to time. With British backing, Gusau reportedly nominated Shonekan for the position on August 25 when the outgoing General Babangida decided to make Shonekan the chairman of the interim national government as an exit strategy rather than General Olusegun Obasanjo or one or two other candidates. In the tense environment of schemes and counter-schemes preceding the November coup, Gusau was not originally supposed to accompany the group to confront Shonekan. As a bona fide coup merchant himself, some say he had his own plans for power, but that unknown to him, the Lagos group that backed Abacha's takeover had identified him for retirement. He allegedly heard of the original plan to confront Shonekan without him and reportedly confronted Abacha about it. Abacha and Diya then invited him along for the show, some say by some sort of trick. With Shonekan's resignation letter in hand, General Sani Abacha invoked a version of the legally moribund Decree No. 61 of 1993 as the basis for his assumption of power as the most senior minister. Less than 24 hours later, he would abrogate this same Decree No. 61 that he claimed brought him into office. Generals Abacha and Diya called a meeting of the interim national government to apprise them of developments and pledged collaboration. Once this was done, they returned to Lagos to meet with the Lagos group of military officers for the usual post-coup horse trading in order to distribute appointments and chart the way forward. Within 24 hours after Shonekan's removal, Lieutenant General Gusau was baited into an open disagreement with his colleagues over the issue of a sovereign national conference. He found himself in an untenable position and submitted his letter of retirement, as Abacha wanted him to do. Major General Mohammed Chris Ali took his place as Army Chief, as had been intended all along by the so-called Lagos group of military conspirators. Lieutenant General Oladipo Diya became Chief of General Staff. Major General Abdulsalami Abubakar became Chief of Defense Staff. Rear Admiral Alison Madueke, Chief of Naval Staff, Air Vice Marshal John Femi remained Chief of Air Staff, and Alhaji Ibrahim Kumasi became Inspector General of Police. The relationship between Aliyu Gusau and Sani Abacha was not a good one until Abacha died in June 1998. At various times, Gusau was under security watch, had his passport impounded, and was prevented from traveling. Once Gusau was on his way out, Abacha moved forward with his maiden broadcast to the nation on November 18, 1993. The new head of state did not mince words and he went for the jugular.
Sequel to the resignation of the former head of the interim national government and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Chief Ernest Shonekan, and my subsequent appointment as head of state and commander-in-chief, I have had extensive consultations within the armed forces hierarchy and other well-meaning Nigerians in a bid to find solutions to the various political, economic, and social problems which have engulfed our beloved country and which have made life most difficult to the ordinary citizens of this nation. Chief Ernest Shonekan took over as head of state and commander-in-chief of the Nigerian Armed Forces at the most trying time in the history of our country. Politically, economically, and socially, there were lots of uncertainties. Things appeared bleak, and the atmosphere was heavy with uncertainties. However, driven by the belief in himself, his countrymen, and love for his country, he accepted to face the challenges of our time. I will therefore like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to him for his selfless service to the nation. He showed great courage at taking on the daunting task of heading the interim national government, even a greater courage to know when to leave. Many have expressed fears about the apparent return of the military. Many have talked about the concern of the international community. However, under the present circumstances, the survival of our beloved country is far above any other consideration. Nigeria is the only country we have. We must therefore solve our problems ourselves. We must lay a very solid foundation for the growth of true democracy. We should avoid any ad hoc or temporary solutions. The problems must be addressed firmly, objectively, decisively, and with all sincerity of purpose. Decree 61 of 1993 is hereby abrogated. A provisional ruling council is hereby established. It will comprise the head of state, commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the Federal Republic of Nigeria as chairman, the chief of general staff as vice chairman, the honorable minister of defense, the chief of defense staff, service chiefs, the inspector general of police, the attorney general and minister of justice, the internal affairs minister, the foreign affairs minister, and the national security advisor. Legislative powers will reside in the council. States will be governed by civilian administrators to be appointed later. Also, a federal executive council will be put in place. Our security system will be enhanced to ensure that lives of citizens, property of individuals are protected and preserved. Drugs trafficking and other economic crimes such as 419 must be tackled and eliminated. On the current strikes throughout the nation, following the increase in the price of fuel, I appeal to all the trade unions to return to work immediately. We cannot afford further dislocation and destruction of our economy. On the closed media houses, government is hereby lifting the order of proscription with immediate effect. We, however, appeal to the media houses that in this spirit of national reconciliation, we should show more restraint and build a united and peaceful Nigeria. Fellow Nigerians, the events of the past month, starting from the annulment of the June 12 presidential election, culminating in the appointment of the former head of state, Chief Ernest Shonekan, are well known to you. The economic downturn has undoubtedly been aggravated by the ongoing political crisis. We require a well thought out and permanent solution to these problems if we are to emerge stronger from them. Consequently, a constitutional conference with full constituent powers will be established soon to determine the future constitutional structure of Nigeria. The Constitutional Conference will also recommend the method of forming parties which will lead to the ultimate recognition of political parties formed by the people. While the conference is on, the reorganization and reform of the following major institutions will be carried out: the military, the police, the customs, the judiciary, NITEL, NNPC, NEPA, the banking industry, and our higher institutions of learning. This regime will be firm, humane, and decisive. We will not condone nor tolerate any act of indiscipline. Any attempt to test our will be decisively dealt with.
When Major General Ibrahim Babangida came to power after the Palace coup of August 1985, he rewarded then Major General Sani Abacha, GOC of the Army's 2nd Division, with the post of Chief of Army Staff, the position from which Babangida had launched himself into power. Abacha reportedly negotiated for this position as a condition for supporting the coup. However, Abacha was not well regarded professionally. He was thought of as a very dull officer who was prone to late coming, disliked staff meetings, kept odd hours, enjoyed exclusive private parties, and loved entertaining himself with curious personal interests. There were rumors that he had not made it out of the staff college at Jaji with honor, that some of his old confidential reports were much below par, and that he had been saved on several occasions from retirement during his military career. One such occasion was a controversial bloody clash with the police when he was the brigade commander in Port Harcourt in the late 70s. Nevertheless, he was a key coup conspirator in December 1983 and August 1985. According to sources, soon after he became army chief in 1985, one of the first things Abacha did was intimidate many local and foreign army contractors into arrangements from which he would benefit personally. Some of those who met him then say he seemed to be driven by a fanatical desire to compete financially with his rival and protege, General Babangida, who had been the immediate past holder of that office. The dysfunctional manifestations of this rivalry dogged Abacha throughout his career as a service chief and later as head of state. Allegedly, he always felt that he needed to stash away huge sums of money as a way to guarantee his personal security. It remains unclear to this day why he felt that way. Abacha was also very state security conscious and regularly took a hard line against soldiers suspected of disloyalty. He was party to the decision to execute General Vatsa and others in March 1986 in spite of numerous domestic and foreign pleas, and was not happy when the charge against Major Akinyemi was changed from treason to treasonable felony. His displeasure was that the lesser charge guaranteed that even if guilty, he would not be executed. Never a man to forget old grudges, Abacha stubbornly refused to release the major from prison 10 years later, even after he completed his sentence. In time, Abacha's poor management skills and lack of professional respect undermined him within the caucus of junior and middle-ranking officers that brought Babangida to power. As the chief of army staff, he was even allegedly personally insulted by then Major Sambo Dasuki, an incident that eventually led to the major's first protective exile to the United States on a course. Clamor began that Abacha be removed as army chief to make way for a more professionally sound officer. As a result, other ambitious senior army officers began eyeing his job, notably Brigadier later Major General Joshua Dongoyaro, who had also been a key insider in the coup that propelled Babangida to power. Not far behind were other officers of the regular one course at the Nigerian Defense Academy who felt that their time had come to take over the leadership of the army from foreign-trained officers. Such regular one officers included Saliu Ibrahim, Aliyu Gusau, and Oladipo Diya. Abacha's reaction to all this was to accuse Babangida of deliberately underfunding the army so as to make him unpopular with the troops. Things were bad enough at one stage that a secret meeting of insiders outside the context of the Armed Forces Ruling Council had to be held at Ikeja cantonment to smooth things over. Sources claim special financial arrangements were made to placate Abacha and allay suspicions, while alternative mechanisms like ad hoc task forces were later created to ensure that funds actually reached operational units, bypassing the Ministry of Defense. Nevertheless, clamor continued for Abacha's removal. Eventually, General Babangida concocted a dicey two-step scheme to do so. The scheme involved the initial removal of Lieutenant General Katsbali as concurrent chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Minister of Defense. In this scenario, Babangida became the Minister of Defense, while Abacha was to simultaneously hold the positions of Chief of Army Staff and Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. Step 2 would involve Babangida giving up the Minister of Defense position and then later enticing Abacha to take the Minister of Defense position in combination with the position of Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. In exchange, Abacha would vacate the position of Chief of Army Staff. This delicate two-step process, initiated on December 29, 1989, was complicated by negative reactions to the Step 1 removal of Lieutenant General Katsbali and the perception that the changes affected the religious balance of power in the military. Bali himself refused to accept his demeaning redeployment as Minister of Internal Affairs, where he would take over from Brigadier John Shagaya, a junior officer from the same Langtan area of Plateau States. Instead, he chose to retire 10 days later. In April 1990, citing a laundry list of complaints, junior officers led by Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Inyam, Major Saliba Mukoro, and Major Gideon Oka staged an attempted coup which eventually failed. One of their complaints was the shabby and dishonorable treatment meted on the longest-serving Nigerian general in the person of General Katsbali, who in actual fact had given credibility to the Babangida administration. By all accounts, most of the credit for rallying the resistance and crushing this coup attempt goes to Lieutenant General Sani Abacha, who was at that time the Chief of Army Staff and concurrent Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. After the rebellion was crushed, Abacha went on the radio to reassure the country. General Abacha's role in saving the Babangida regime in 1990 brought him huge stock, not only with Babangida himself, but also with a significant number of other IBB boys. It marked the beginning of the rise of Sani Abacha and the beginnings of his own independent client network, separate from the umbilical cord that tied him into the Matana Babangida bandwagon. His own independent network would later become known as Abacha Boys, based mainly, but not exclusively, around officers from the Kano area. After a lull during which Babangida was very nervous and lacked confidence, he later resumed the old plan to replace Abacha as Chief of Army Staff. In September 1990, after 2 batches of executions of Okaku convicts had been carried out, Babangida ceded his position as Minister of Defense to General Abacha, who was to combine it with his position as Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. Some observers feel that an unwritten part of this new arrangement was that Abacha would be left alone to do as he pleased with defense funds, while Babangida ran the rest of the government. To crystallize the new space created for General Abacha as the defense chief, he stayed behind in Lagos when Babangida moved to the new capital of Abuja in 1991. It was as if the country had 2 governments. However, rather than make fellow coup merchant, then Major General Joshua Dongoyaro the Chief of Army Staff, Babangida prudently chose Major General Saliu Ibrahim, the GOC 82 Division. Ibrahim was a respected apolitical armored corps officer with no history of involvement in coup except as a victim in August 1985 when he was arrested in Jos during Babangida's takeover. Dogoyaro was placated with command of Ecomog in Liberia after the fiasco during which President Samuel Doe was abducted right under the nose of Ghanaian General Arnold Kwaino. Abacha retained the combined positions of Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Defense Minister until August 26, 1993. After the events of April 1990, Babangida was often quoted as referring to him as Khalifa, meaning successor. Meanwhile, it should be noted that although Vice Admiral Aikomo was transitioned from the office of Chief of General Staff and made the Vice President in 1990 to Babangida, that slot was actually initially proposed to Chief Ernest Shonekan, a civilian United African Company executive. There have been so many stories about the political countdown and endless transition of the Babangida regime. As is well known, the date of the final handing over of power was shifted from 1990 to 1992 and then 1993. Now, let us look at the role Abacha played in this as a behind-the-scenes manipulator. Based in part on the report of the Political Bureau, which was originally set up in 1986, a two-party system was created in October 1989. They were the National Republican Convention (NRC) and the Social Democratic Party (SDP). Both parties were run and financed by the government, which also arrogated to itself the right to write their party constitutions. The constitutional context was the 1989 Constitution, or Decree No. 12 of 1989, based on work done by the Constitution Review Committee, ratified by the Constituent Assembly and amended by the Armed Forces Ruling Council. Among the 11 amendments imposed by the AFRC, 3 were defense and security related. One removed the National Assembly's control over national security because, according to the AFRC, it exposes the chief executives and the nation to clear impotence in the face of threat to security. The second deleted certain provisions establishing an Armed Forces Service Commission to supervise the implementation of the federal character principle. The third amendment removed Section 1, Subsection 4 of the draft constitution, which had outlawed coup and classified them as criminal. Initially, based on Decree No. 25 of 1987, amended by Decree No. 9 of 1989, there was a ban on all former politicians and top office holders since 1960, particularly those previously found guilty of abuse of office. However, both decrees were repealed in December 1991, initially under pressure from northern elders, but ultimately to create a level playing field for all ethnic groups. Similarly, based on Decree No. 19 of 1987 and amended by Decree No. 26 of 1989, the plan was for presidential elections in November 1992. However, as a result of alleged malpractices during party primaries in September 1992, primaries were cancelled altogether in October 1992. Major contenders were frozen out and the timetable was shifted to 1993. Local, state, and national committees of both parties were dissolved and replaced by caretaker committees. The Babangida government later announced that they would be audited. The driving principle behind all of this was Babangida's fear of powerful financially independent politicians and the secret desire to plant and pick controllable new-breed politicians in state government houses and legislative positions all over the country as a civilian base for a diarchy which he would head at the center. Those who lost out in the cancellation of the 1992 presidential primaries and were banned included the retired Major General Shehu Yaradua, who won the SDP nomination hands down, and Chief Olufalaye. Alhajis Adamu Shiroma and Umaru Shinkafi were about to go in for a runoff for the NRC nomination. They too were banned. A few weeks later, on November 17, 1992, General Babangida dissolved the AFRC and, after a pregnant pause, created the National Defense and Security Council (NDSC) on January 2, 1993. A civilian transitional council was also set up to replace the Council of Ministers and win back waning public confidence in the transition program following the failed presidential primaries. Its chairman was Chief Ernest Shonekan, also known as Head of Government. Empowered by Decree No. 54 of 1992, the Transitional Council shared joint responsibility with the National Defense and Security Council to ensure a smooth and successful handover to civilians. It was after all of this that Alhaji Bashir Othman Tofa and Chief Moshood Kashimawo Olawale Abiola later emerged as the presidential contenders from the NRC and SDP respectively. All of this was being monitored by the security services, as well as General Sani Abacha, who later told confidants that Babangida had been toying with the idea of ruling Nigeria for 30 years. When Chief Abiola first showed interest in running for the presidency, certain IBB boys, including Abacha, expressed concern and approached Babangida to find some way to ban Abiola from taking part. However, based on a security report which falsely projected Alhaji Babagana Kingibe as the likely winner of the SDP presidential primary convention in Jos, Babangida assured his concerned military boys that Abiola would not prevail, and thus there was no need for fear. On the other hand, he simultaneously assured Abiola that he could run for office if he so wished and would have no problems if he won fair and square. He did not tell Abiola, as far as is publicly known at that early stage, that there were restive northern officers opposed to his political ambitions, nor did he tell his caucus officers that he had given his word to Abiola that he could run for office. Interestingly, Abiola himself was independently familiar with most members of the Babangida military caucus, either as business associates or as a financial sponsor of previous coup in 1983 and 1985, in which they had played key roles. As things turned out, to the consternation of military officers like Abacha who were opposed to Chief Abiola, Abiola narrowly won the SDP nomination at the Jos Convention, overcoming determined opposition from a motley group of SDP governors and disgruntled former aspirants. However, security forces reported allegations of massive vote buying. Concerned officers approached Babangida to use the report as an excuse to ban Abiola and stop the process at that stage before it evolved to formal national elections. Meanwhile, as the June elections came nearer, against a backdrop of anti-military agitation by students and workers' groups, General Olusegun Obasanjo and Chief Anthony Enaoro publicly expressed doubts over the sincerity of the military's intention to leave power. Caught between an undercurrent of public suspicions that he had a hidden agenda and behind-the-scene pressure from some powerful elements of his military caucus to scuttle the transition again, Babangida initially resisted the military pressure. Alhaji Babagana Kingibe emerged after difficult negotiations as Abiola's running mate, while Dr. Sylvester Ugo was chosen as Tofa's vice presidential candidate. It must be mentioned, however, that the voice of the military was by no means uniform. There were officers like Lieutenant General Saliu Ibrahim, General Shola Williams, Brigadier MC Ali, Colonel Abubakar Umar, and a few others who genuinely wanted a disengagement of the military from politics. Some people claim Lieutenant General Oladipo Diya was also not in favor of the military perpetuating itself at this stage. Other officers preferred one candidate versus the other, while a small clique did not want to leave power for either candidate. This clique included Lieutenant General Joshua Dongoyaro, Brigadier David Mark, Brigadier Stephen Anthony Ukpo, Brigadier John Shagaya, Brigadier Alilu Akilu, and a few others, all of whom were IBB boys. What is really fascinating is how General Abacha concealed his real motives and intentions from most military officers. At the few senior officer conferences he attended, Abacha would typically remain quiet. He preferred to express his strong views to Babangida directly and privately, while quietly mobilizing opinion behind the scenes and maintaining discreet contact with civilian leaders of thought who were opposed to the elections in general and to Chief Abiola specifically. Meanwhile, to those unfamiliar with their inner tensions, he positioned himself as the guarantor of the Babangida regime. Major General MC Ali, for example, said that Abacha had the patience of a hook-line fisherman or a bush hunter and the memory of an elephant and a native cunning to match. In addition to this cacophony of discordant but troubling military voices, there were powerful civilian pressures, notably from the Sultan of Sokoto, Ibrahim Dasuki, as well as other emirs who allegedly did not like or trust either Tofa or Abiola. In the background, personalities who had been banned or skimped out from contesting as a result of government fiat were also opposed to the elections. These included retired Major General Shehu Yaradua and Alhaji Abubakar Rimi. Funny enough, Alhaji Bashir Tofa, who was a candidate supported by some elements within the NRC, also joined the bandwagon to boycott and or cancel the elections. Then there were mischievous campaigners like the Association for Better Nigeria (ABN), which wanted the military to hold on to power. All these internal groups and persons working hard to scuttle the elections altogether were opposed by foreign countries like Britain and the US, which wanted the military to leave power. Nevertheless, on June 10, 1993, ignoring outer clauses in Decree No. 13 of 1993 and Decree No. 19 of 1987, Justice Basi Ikpeme of the Abuja High Court granted a motion brought by the ABN to restrain the Electoral Commission (NEC) from conducting the election. However, citing lack of jurisdictional authority, General Babangida initially chose to ignore the court, which was why the NEC went ahead to conduct the election on June 12, which was later said to be free and fair. On June 16, Professor Humphrey Nwosu announced, after results for 14 of the 30 states were already known, that the NEC would suspend announcing election results. The results increasingly pointed toward an apparent win by Chief Moshood Abiola, pending appeals to higher courts against lower courts' injunctions. The entire result was later released by a pressure group called the Campaign for Democracy (CD), suggesting that Abiola won the majority of votes in 19 states, while Tofa won 11 states. However, pressure from key army factions continued behind the scene. General Babangida left Abuja and went to Minna for urgent consultations with elements of his original 1985 military coup caucus. The majority of these elements, including Abacha, had become thoroughly fed up with his previous assurances that Abiola was not going to make it past the Jos Convention. They were now faced with the reality of an impending Abiola presidency. Practically holding Babangida hostage, they reportedly gave him the option to choose between annulling the elections or leaving the office voluntarily, short of which it is alleged he and Abiola might be killed. While all of this was going on, strange items of correspondence were circulating, alleging that if Moshood Abiola were to be allowed to take office, he would purge the military, move the capital back to Lagos, and take other actions deemed threatening to vested interests. Arguments were reportedly made in certain circles that Babangida was, by acts of benign neglect, about to destroy the legacy of the Sardauna of Sokoto and yield political and ultimately military power to an ethnic region that already dominated the country economically. This was amplified by interesting explanations that Abiola could not be controlled and that he was owed large sums of money by the federal government, which he would now unethically control, that he had many wives and concubines, and so on. Thrown into the mix were arguments about the controversial Jos Convention of the SDP, where he allegedly bought votes, and the basic unfairness of preventing those who won the party primaries in September 1992 from contesting. One school of thought felt that, in fairness, since Abiola had gone through the electoral process and spent large sums of money, he ought to be paid off for his expenses and then advised as a friend to avoid politics and stick to business. On June 21, 1993, Justice Dahiru Saleh of the Abuja High Court voided the election, even though the appeal by NEC was pending at the Court of Appeal. A formal announcement to the nation of the cancellation followed on June 23rd after a nocturnal military meeting that day before of IBB boys at the presidential villa. During the meeting, most military officers rejected a negotiated compromise to resolve the impasse, preferring an all-out annulment. Shortly thereafter, a state of military alert was announced, and the Chief of Army Staff, Lieutenant General Saliu Ibrahim, went around army formations in the country to explain the annulment. According to Major General MC Ali, who was at that time Director of Military Intelligence (DMI), most soldiers were unhappy about the annulment for three reasons. First, they were fed up with the domination of a small clique of officers who had been in power since 1983. Second, in spite of General Babangida's settlements or material bribes, soldiers wanted to return to their professional roles. Third, many were upset about their deployment to Liberia to be killed like animals without national consensus or proper logistic support. But they had little choice as a result of command influence but to go along with it, at least on the surface. Meanwhile, according to Ali, security operatives were busy constructing overt and covert threats to the life of Chief MKO Abiola. Protests and riots erupted, especially in Lagos and other parts of Chief Abiola's home region of the country. In response, General Sani Abacha gave marching orders to the governor of Lagos State, Sir Michael Otedola, to restore order or risk exposing his citizens to the fury of the Nigerian army. Less than 24 hours later, soldiers of the Nigerian army poured into the streets of Lagos and shot hundreds of unarmed demonstrators indiscriminately on Abacha's orders. Meanwhile, the military became very unpopular, and officers even feared wearing their uniforms publicly. Following the annulment, General Obasanjo suggested that Babangida set up an interim presidential council comprising former heads of state, excluding Babangida, to negotiate the transition to a future permanent form of government. This plan would retain democratic structures at state and local levels, as well as the National Assembly at the national level, but the National Executive would be an interim government responsible to the Presidential Council. Babangida did not like the idea of a Presidential Council without him, but liked the notion of an interim national government as an exit strategy. A committee under Lieutenant General Joshua Dongoyaro meanwhile urged new elections under new rules, as Babangida had indicated in a speech to the nation on June 26. This proposed new presidential election was alleged to be conducted before August 27, 1993, even though the government statement dissolved the NEC, which would have been charged to conduct such an election. Babangida viewed this as a trap aimed at him and quietly maneuvered to slip out of it. Initially, the SDP predictably rejected any plans for a new election, and Abiola meanwhile refused to give up his mandate. However, after the usual Nigerian cajoling and bribing, political leaders of the SDP independently distanced themselves from Moshood Abiola, as well as governors and legislators originally elected on SDP tickets. The SDP, under Chief Tony Aneni and Alhaji Sule Lamido, then agreed on July 7, 1993 to an unelected interim national government in which they would collaborate with the NRC under Hamid Kusamotu and Tom Ekimi, as well as General Babangida, to the exclusion of Abiola, the apparent winner of the June 12 elections. Aneni's action caused a rift in the SDP that was later said to be resolved on October 11, well into the life of the interim national government. This development, which was the result of Babangida's personal initiative, left the head of state with the challenge of determining how he would tiptoe around his military shacks to guarantee his personal safety and exit from power, as well as provide military backing to the legitimacy of the interim national government. The only way he could have done this successfully was to assume full operational and policy control of the reins of the defense and security establishment, which meant he had to find a way to continue as Commander-in-Chief and Minister of Defense after August 27, 1993. Unfortunately, Babangida had dribbled his own military backers once too many and was unable to get support for such an arrangement from them. He did not trust them. They did not trust him. And neither did they trust themselves. It increasingly became clear that Babangida's personal political agenda and that of the Nigerian military officers who brought him to power in 1985 were divergent. To freeze Abiola out, the government released spate of decrees. These included, but were not limited to, Decree No. 39 of 1993, also known as Presidential Elections Repeal Decree; Decree No. 40, also known as Transition to Civil Rule; Decree No. 41, also known as Presidential Election, Invalidation of Court Order Decree. Media organizations like The Punch, Concord Press, Sketch, Abuja Newsday, Ogun State Broadcasting Corporation, and The Observer were proscribed. Then, a tripartite committee comprising military, government, and political parties representatives was set up on July 31, 1993 to determine how to manage what was left of the transition. The military was represented by Lieutenant General Joshua Dongoyaro and Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusau, along with Brigadiers David Mark, John Shagaya, and Anthony Okpo. This configuration pointedly excluded most members of Abacha's Lagos group and provided some insights into Babangida's thinking and Abacha's cunning. Dongoyaro and the David Mark groups were neck-deep in the interim national government organizational intrigues, which Babangida half-heartedly hoped to manipulate in order to guarantee a military role for himself after August 27. Meanwhile, Abacha was quietly consolidating and networking within the military, probing for weaknesses and lining up his ducks in a row. But Abacha was crafty enough to allow some overlap. Brigadier David Mark, for example, was initially simultaneously in Abacha's Lagos group, as well as being in the IBB group. In this manner, a casual observer would superficially view the network of groups as one continuum of IBB Abacha boys, while Abacha quietly worked underground to crystallize his own clique. Abacha family believed in the concept of keeping one's enemies even closer to one than one's friends until he was ready to strike. The interim national government was represented by Chief Ernest Shonekan as head of state, Mr. Clement Akpambu as Minister of Justice, and Professor Jerry Ghana of the Ministry of Agriculture and Natural Resources, among others. The NRC was represented by Alhaji Adamu Shiroma, Alhaji Bashar Dalhatu, Mr. John Nwodo, Chief Tom Ikimi, and Mr. Eyo Ita. The SDP was represented by Mr. Patrick Dele Cole, Chief Jim Nwobodo, Alhaji Olushola Saraki, Chief Dakpo Sarumi, Mr. Joseph Toba, Alhaji Abubakar Rimi, and retired Major General Shehu Yaradua. In this confused situation, General MC Ali raised the possibility of overthrowing General Babangida with the Chief of Army Staff, Lieutenant General Saliu Ibrahim, who was reluctant to support such a move for a variety of professional, political, and practical reasons, including his deep distrust of General Abacha. Next, Ali approached the Minister of Defense Sani Abacha with the same idea. Abacha's main concern was whether the Chief of Army Staff Saliu Ibrahim would back such a move. Ali lied to Abacha by saying that he had not yet approached Saliu Ibrahim. Caught between two key officers who did not trust one another, Ali initially backed off. But as the situation further deteriorated and army prestige was at an all-time low, Ali again approached Abacha, this time at home, in the presence of Lieutenant General Jeremiah Uzeni. Again, Abacha chose to be obdurate, taciturn, and reflective. But Ali saw through him and concluded rightly that Abacha had some kind of personal design that he was not yet ready to spring, preferring General Babangida to leave the scene first, peacefully. Simultaneously, other dynamics may have been at play between Generals Babangida and Abacha. One unconfirmed account says that although they had a pact, their wives did not get along and that Mrs. Babangida did not relish the thought of her husband handing over to General Abacha. Meanwhile, other pro-IBB and anti-IBB military interest groups were scheming, including some core IBB boys who basically wanted to implement a self-succession plan after which professional officers in the military would be purged through a process of being set up and eliminated. There was also a last-ditch effort to get the National Assembly to draft Babangida in some sort of role following annulment, but according to rumors, this effort failed after money had already changed hands. On August 2, 1993, the Chief of Army Staff, Lieutenant General Saliu Ibrahim, told senior officers of the army in Lagos that difficulties in arranging a new presidential election before August 27, 1993 had persuaded the government with the backing of the two parties and foreign countries to form an interim national government (ING). The ING would organize elections and carry out government responsibilities. Officers discussed options for a full civilian government composed of the two parties, a mixed civilian-military interim regime, or a full temporary military regime. Those present recommended that Babangida should stay no longer than August 27, 1993, and that officers from all three services should work out the details for transition. Such officers should not have held political positions in the government. They also recommended that the National Assembly be on recess while the ING was active and that the two political parties be self-financing. The interesting thing about this process of military consultation on the transitional program was that it was parallel to the tripartite committee mentioned earlier. On August 3, 1993, faced with real and imagined threats to his life and with no hope of getting Babangida to rescind his decision on the June 12 matter, Chief Moshood Abiola left Nigeria for Europe. On August 17, General Babangida informed the National Assembly that he was stepping aside. His service chiefs did not accompany him to the National Assembly, which was a breach of protocol and an indicator that he was fast losing control of the military. On that same day, which happened to be his birthday, senior officers from all three services met in Lagos and reaffirmed that Babangida could not continue in office. They did not, however, appoint a successor to replace him, nor did they make room for him to play the role of a commander-in-chief during an interim government. This oversight, which Babangida was not pleased about, was very convenient for Abacha's game plan. On the strength of recommendation of the tripartite committee, the government then established the Nwambweze panel. It was tasked to draft a constitution for the proposed interim national government. The panel was headed by Professor Ben Nwambweze. In those dangerous days, officers who used to be freely admitted into Babangida's courtyard with their security details were now required to be disarmed and to leave their details as far away as possible. There was at least one such incident involving General Abacha himself. On August 25, 1993, with options for a safe exit closing fast, General Babangida settled on Chief Ernest Shonekan as his candidate for the chairmanship of the proposed interim national government. Shonekan, incidentally, was not only Yoruba like Abiola, but also from Abeokuta in Ogun State like Abiola. Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusau, then the National Security Advisor, reportedly influenced his appointment, and the British government supported it. The Nigerian military as an institution had nothing to do with his appointment. Shonekan reportedly agreed as a condition of his appointment not to reopen the June 12 matter. He also allegedly made a commitment to assist in preventing Yorubas from forming a united front on the issue. Another curious agreement was that Shonekan would not move into the official presidential villa in Abuja, but would instead stay at the presidential guest house. The main villa was to be left vacant. Another interesting decision General Babangida made in his confused state of mind was to leave General Abacha behind as the Secretary of Defense and Vice Chairman of the interim national government, reportedly as an insurance against coup and to ensure unity of the military in backing the interim national government. In other words, genuinely concerned about the safety of the hen house, Babangida asked the fox to guard it. To counterbalance Abacha, however, Babangida planned to appoint Lieutenant General Joshua Dongoyaro as the Chief of Defense Staff. Abacha would guide policy, while Dongoyaro would take charge of operations. This curious arrangement was actually a default for which Babangida had no serious options, except perhaps Brigadier David Mark. Once he lost the backing of the armed forces to continue in either a military or political role after August 27, he had to rely on an unstable alliance of those he had relied all along to keep power. On August 26, 1993, a retirement parade was held at Eagle Square in Abuja for General Babangida. Following the parade, Babangida, displeased at their lack of backing for his continuation in office as the CNC, announced, along with his, the retirement of all his service chiefs with effect from August 27, 1993, and announced the appointment of Lieutenant General Dongoyaro as Chief of Defense Staff. The service chiefs retired were Lieutenant General Saliu Ibrahim, Chief of Army Staff, Air Vice Marshal Dada, Chief of Air Staff, Vice Admiral Preston Omashola, Chief of Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Murtala Onyako, Deputy Chief of Defense Staff, and Alhaji Aliyu Atta, the Inspector General of Police. Following this announcement by Babangida, the Director of Military Intelligence, Brigadier General MC Ali, met with General Abacha in his bedroom and advised that the retirement made by Babangida be rescinded to help stabilize the tense situation between the armed forces and Babangida on one hand and the Nigerian public on the other. Abacha listened calmly, counseled patience, and advised that there was the need to consolidate military authority before further action. What Abacha did next was a classic move. General Sani Abacha met with the retired service chiefs, empathized with the way they were treated, and offered to extend the effective date of their retirement until September 17th. Then, the next day, with their support, he backdated the date of Babangida's retirement from the army to August 26, a step which rendered Babangida's pronouncement from the 27th invalid. Then, he later rescinded Dongoyaro's appointment as Chief of Defense Staff, arguing that three Northerners should not unfairly monopolize top jobs in defense. The three Northerners were Abacha himself as the Secretary of Defense, Dongoyaro as Chief of Defense Staff, and Gusau as Chief of Army Staff. Abacha then offered the position of Chief of Defense Staff to Lieutenant General Oladipo Diya, Commandant of the National War College and a Yoruba from Abiola's home state of Ogun. This was a cynical move by Abacha, who had little regard for Diya personally and most Yoruba officers in general. But Abacha needed to isolate Dongoyaro and had larger designs on the political class, particularly Yoruba leaders of thought, who he was going to use Diya to pacify. Therefore, the Yoruba strategy was useful, for now. The transition from Babangida to Shonekan was codified by a number of decrees. Decree number 59 of 1993 ended the Babangida administration, while Decree number 61 created the interim national government. Thus, at about 3:30 p.m. on August 26, 1993, Ernest Shonekan was sworn in as the new head of state and president of the interim national government by the Chief Justice of Nigeria, Justice Mohammed Bello, at the presidential villa, Abuja. He was not, however, sworn in as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. This oversight was also deliberate.
I, Ernest Shonekan, do solemnly swear that I will faithful and bear true allegiance to the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and that I will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So help me God.
Another interesting detail was that Decree number 61 of 1993 that established the interim national government identified General Abacha by name as the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, and Senior Minister. The Senior Minister was empowered to succeed the President of the interim national government in the event of resignation or other untoward events. Thus, Abacha was Shonekan's designated successor, and Shonekan had no operational control of the armed forces. A number of military-era decrees were then abrogated. However, 2 days later, the National Labour Congress (NLC) began a nationwide strike to protest fuel scarcity. Shonekan addressed Nigerians on August 31, 1993. He had begun the process of releasing most of those detained for their involvement in pro-June 12 riots, like Chief Gani Fawayimi, Dr. Beko Ransom Kuti, and Mr. Femi Falana. He reopened some universities that had been shut down and lobbied the National Union of Petroleum and Natural Gas Workers (NUPENG) and the NLC to suspend industrial actions. For the military, Shonekan promised to start phased withdrawals from Liberia. Even as Shonekan was making these lofty pronouncements, Abacha was well on his way. It was on September 3 that he publicly announced what had already transpired behind the scenes. Lieutenant General Oladipo Diya was his replacement for Lieutenant General Joshua Dongoyaro as Chief of Defense Staff. Air Commodore John Femi was to replace Air Commodore Nsekak Edwak as Chief of Air Staff, while retaining Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusau as Chief of Army Staff and Rear Admiral Suleiman Seidu as Chief of Naval Staff. Simultaneously, he ordered the military task force on petroleum to restore the normal supply of fuel to marketers within 24 hours. 2 days later, the killing of 7 Nigerian soldiers serving the UN peacekeeping force in Mogadishu, Somalia, was announced. It resulted in a fact-finding tour led by Brigadier General Cyril Iweze. On September 13th, Defense Headquarters issued a curious clarification over the recent army postings, saying that it had no political undertone. Spokesman Colonel Fred Chijuka said a similar exercise was underway in the Navy and the Air Force. A week later, Chijuka was again making another statement, this time to announce the appointment of new divisional commanders and the retirement of Lieutenant General Joshua Limiel Dongoyaro. With his position made untenable by Abacha, Dongoyaro voluntarily retired from the army alerting the country in the process that Abacha was in the opening phase of an all-out assault on democracy. As the coup merchant himself, Dongoyaro should not have had any difficulty in reading the signs. On the political front, meanwhile, the calculation that Shonekan's appointment as head of the interim national government would split the Yoruba people and make it easier to consign the June 12 election to the rubbish heap of history failed. Political threats against Shonekan began as he took office, and his house even had to be protected from arsonists.
Interim is interim. Interim, from the way I look at it, is not a democratically elected civilian government. Interim means somebody is handpicked. Come and stay here. That, in other words, means installation.
The governors of Oyo, Ogun, Osun, and Ondo states, for example, refused, at least in public, to recognize Shonekan as the head of state. They and other Yoruba opinion leaders also requested Yoruba-speaking elements in the interim national government to resign their appointments. The legality of the interim national government was also challenged in courts. Pro-democracy rallies resumed. To douse this flame, Shonekan, who had earlier agreed as a condition of his appointment not to raise the June 12 issue, and even stated on September 28 that his government would not do so, was advised by some to establish the Mama Nasser panel to investigate June 12. He announced this on October 1, even as security men were arresting waves of pro-democracy supporters. 2 days later, in a storm of controversy in the press, members of the SDP in the interim national government threatened to pull out, claiming that they had only accepted to serve initially because they thought they were supporting a palace coup to oust the former head of state, Ibrahim Babangida. Meanwhile, the National Assembly was locked into an internal battle over efforts to repeal the decree that annulled the June 12 election in the first place. Both Shonekan and Abiola were touring the country to raise support for their respective agendas. Abiola filed a court motion to declare the interim national government illegal. Shonekan was also later accused, without evidence, of trying to bribe opposing members of the National Assembly in an attempt to gain legitimacy and expand his national support base. As far as the army was concerned, Shonekan relied on his personal friendship with Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusau, the former National Security Advisor and the new Chief of Army Staff. According to reports, both Gusau and Rear Admiral Suleiman Seidu of the Navy were alleged to have discussed the possibility of retiring Abacha with Shonekan. If true, it would have been interesting indeed to see how this would have transpired in practice. All the service chiefs had clearly treated Shonekan with disdain. For example, during the passing out parade at the National Defense Academy that year, Shonekan was not accompanied by any of the service chiefs. Such an alleged but presumably unsuccessful effort on the part of Gusau and Seidu against Abacha, therefore, if true, would have had the effect of marking both men for subsequent retirement when Abacha started his final push into Aso Rock. Long before this time, military officers had begun settling down into various groups and cliques. What later became known as the Sani Abacha Lagos Group or caucus comprised various combinations among officers like Brigadier Ahmed Aboki Abdullahi, Brigadier Bashar Magashi, Brigadier Chris Ali, Brigadier Ishaya Bamayi, Brigadier Patrick Aziza, Brigadier Tajuddin Olarewaju, Brigadier Ibrahim Gumel, Brigadier David Mark, Air Commodore M.A. Johnson, Rear Admiral FBI Pobeni, Colonel Lawan Gwadabe, and Lieutenant Colonel Sambo Dasuki. This group often met in the guest house of Brigadier Bashar Magashi at Ikoyi. It is pertinent to mention that Brigadier M.C. Ali, the former Director of Military Intelligence who later became GOC 1st Division and then Chief of Army Staff, was invited into the group by Brigadier Ahmed Aboki Abdullahi, not by General Abacha. Nevertheless, it seems apparent that Abacha must have engineered it, appreciative of Brigadier MC Ali's confidential visits to his office and home all along. Between August 27th and September 17th, Abacha made more critical decisions to the effective political and operational chief of all the armed services. He publicly announced new army postings in Lagos without recourse to Shonekan, who was concealed at Abuja. Obviously, the lame duck service chiefs who owed him the decency of being properly retired with adequate 3-week notice and traditional pull-out ceremonies did not question his moves. By September 20, therefore, when the new service chiefs finally took office, new officers adjudged loyal to General Abacha were occupying all the strategically sensitive commands in the army. Dangerous IBB boys were defanged, first by being posted out to politically safe locations and then subsequently kicked out of the army entirely, in stages. Indeed, nearly all the officers who helped Abacha to power eventually felt his jackboots. Most amusingly, Brigadier Halilu Akilu, erstwhile powerful Director General of the National Intelligence Agency, was posted to the Oshodi resettlement scheme to rehabilitate disabled and retiring soldiers. The Lagos group had begun preparing actively for the overthrow of the Shonekan government right from the moment it was sworn in. Nominations were accepted and votes counted at meetings of the entire caucus or an inner caucus within the outer caucus. In this manner, General Sani Abacha was elected by a self-appointed military electoral college to take over as head of state, commander-in-chief, and minister of defense. Lieutenant General Diya was voted to be his chief of general staff, beating Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusau. Major General Abdusalami Abubakar beat Major Generals Edward Unima and Cyril Iweze for the position of Chief of Defense Staff. Then Brigadier, later Major General MC Ali, was told that the scenario had been set for the position of Chief of Army Staff to fall on him. This implied that Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusau, who had been appointed to that position by outgoing head of state Ibrahim Babangida, was to be prospectively frozen out of any top military position in the planned Abacha dispensation. Similarly, Rear Admiral Suleiman Saidu was later edged out as Chief of Naval Staff in favor of Rear Admiral Alisima Duike in a high-stakes game of ethnic balancing championed by Brigadiers MC Ali and Aboki Abdullahi. General Gusau expressed the opinion that a full military regime at that stage would be unwise and might destroy the military. General Abubakar questioned the rush into removing Chief Shonekan, who had only just been installed. On September 24, a few days after Abacha had fully consolidated military control, Chief Moshood Abiola returned to Nigeria from Britain. A large crowd of supporters received him at the presidential wing. From the airport, his first stop, even before he went home, was Defense House in Lagos, where he met secretly with General Abacha behind closed doors. Knowledgeable insiders say that both Abacha and Diya encouraged Abiola to return home against Shonekan's wishes. Shonekan, meanwhile, on the advice of a local kitchen cabinet of close associates, was beginning to behave like a head of state and attend foreign meetings. For example, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly on October 7th, even as he was being sued at home for releasing money to the NEC for the purpose of conducting fresh elections and for setting up a panel of inquiry into the annulment of the elections. Even Fela Kuti publicly described the Shonekan government as neo-colonialist and as a Western stooge. During this period, Shonekan asked security agencies to investigate corruption in Nigerian parastatals like the NNPC, NEPA, Nigeria Airways, Central Bank, Customs, and many others. Shonekan attended the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting from October 21 to 25, 1993 at Limassol, southwest of Nicosia, on the south coast of Cyprus. At the meeting, Shonekan was embarrassed by an appeal from Sir Douglas Richard Hurd, the British Foreign Secretary, to reach an accommodation with Moshood Abiola, the unofficial winner of the poll. From Limassol, he was reported to be making calls incessantly to Abacha in Nigeria regarding the security situation. The former UAC chief executive may have been unnerved by the back-channel reports of Colonel Umar's arrest and perhaps even alleged whispers from Lieutenant General Gusau about other conspiracies lurking in the shadows. However, Abacha, in a move reminiscent of how he treated General Buhari in 1985, apparently refused to take most of the calls, citing Shonekan's lack of authority over him as the Secretary of Defense. Interestingly, Shonekan announced on October 21 that it planned to scrap the National Guard, a decision that was popular with the mainstream military and was already recommended by the secret Brigadier MC Ali Military Caucus reports. Then, on the last day of the conference, 4 members of the Movement for the Advancement of Democracy (MAD), led by Jerry Yusuf, hijacked a Nigeria Airways bus A310 with 137 passengers and 11 crew bound from Lagos to Abuja. The plane ended up in the Niger Republic, where it was later stormed by Nigerian paramilitary commandos. It was Nigeria's second aircraft hijacking incident, the first having taken place back in April 1967 during tensions leading to the Nigerian Civil War. At that time, a Nigeria Airways Fokker Friendship F-27 bound for Lagos was hijacked from Benin to Enugu by Sami Yang and Onuora Nwaya of the Special Task Force, the militant wing of what later became the Biafran Directorate of Military Intelligence. Fortunately, for most of the hostages, the rescue operation was carried out professionally by the Nigerians and went well. On October 31, word leaked in the Nigerian press about efforts by some influential Nigerians to get the interim national government to dissolve both political parties and all existing political structures. Coincidentally, such a recommendation was indeed part of the MC Ali secret report. This was followed soon after by dramatic events at the National Assembly, following which the Senate President Dr. Iyosha Ayu was impeached on November 2 by pro-ING senators led by Chuba Okadigbo. Senator Ame Ebute then became the new Senate President. All of this came against background plans by the new Electoral Commission led by Professor Okon Uya to organize party primaries from January 7 to 9, 1994, followed by presidential elections on February 19, 1994. On November 6, Northern elders led by former President Shehu Shagari met to find ways to ensure that Nigeria remained united. They expressed reports for the interim national government as the midwife for a stable transition. Under these circumstances, Chief Shonekan, taunted by some for lack of power, symbolically moved into the presidential villa from the presidential guest house in early November, against his original understanding with former head of state Ibrahim Babangida and to the consternation of Sani Abacha. General Abacha was increasingly worried about Shonekan's growing confidence and irritated by security reports to Shonekan that he was planning something. Under pressure from declining international oil prices, Shonekan's government chose at that inauspicious time to withdraw the petroleum subsidy on November 8 and raise the price of petrol from 70 kobo to 3 naira 50 kobo, a massive increase with predictably dramatic effects on inflation. Not surprisingly, this action led to street protests and plans for a full-scale resumption of industrial action by pressure groups. 2 days later, on November 10, 1993, the Shonekan-led interim national government was declared illegal in a ruling at the Lagos High Court presided over by Justice Dolapo Akinsoya. Back in October, as previously noted, a case had been brought by Moshood Abiola and Babangida Kingibe to declare the interim national government illegal, null and void. The lead attorney for the Federal Ministry of Justice, Mr. Dele Jegede, advised the court that Decree No. 61, which was supposedly the legal basis of the interim national government, did not exist. Decree No. 56 had previously fixed August 27, 1993 as the date of commencement of the 1989 Constitution. Justice Akinsoya reasoned that since Babangida had divested himself of power by signing Decree No. 59 of August 26, he had no power to sign Decree No. 61. All of these dovetailed nicely into General Abacha's original skillful backdating of the effective date of Babangida's retirement to August 26th. The day after the court judgment, Professor Bolaji Akinyemi publicly pleaded with General Sani Abacha to rescue Nigeria from a terrible political and legal quagmire. But Abacha, ever so patient and disciplined regarding the timing of coup, resisted being rushed before crossing his T's and dotting his I's. After all, Shonekan's government was contesting the Akinsoya judgment in a higher court, and Abacha still had to watch his flanks within the military carefully. There was still the matter of how to handle the Chief of Army Staff, Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusau, who was not a man to be underrated. On November 17, 1993, at about 10 a.m., Generals Sani Abacha, Oladipo Diya, and Aliyu Gusau arrived at the presidential villa in Abuja, accompanied by truckloads of fearsome-looking soldiers. These troops were under the command of two Lagos group conspirators, namely Colonel Lawan Gwadabe of the National Guard and Brigadier Bashir Magashi of the Brigade of Guards. Magashi was almost certainly there to make sure Gwadabe followed the Abacha script and no other. Following a private meeting with Chief Ernest Shonekan, Abacha graciously allowed Shonekan to deliver a farewell speech to the interim national government after 82 days of controversy, following which he was flown to Lagos. After waiting patiently for so many years, Abacha had finally struck. The Kanuri General then dissolved the legislature as well as the state and local governments and replaced the elected civilian state governors with military and police officers.
Consequently, the following decisions come into immediate effect. The interim national government is hereby dissolved. The national and state assemblies are also dissolved. The state executive councils are dissolved. The brigade commanders are to take over from the governors in their states until administrators are appointed. Where there are no brigade commanders, the commissioners of police in the states are to take over. All local governments stand dissolved. The directors of personnel are to take over the administration of the local governments until administrators are appointed. The National Electoral Commission is hereby dissolved. All former secretaries to federal ministries are to hand over to their director generals until ministers are appointed. The two political parties are hereby dissolved. All processions, political meetings, and associations of any type in any part of the country are hereby banned. Any consultative committee, by whatever name called, is hereby proscribed.
However, in October 1995, Abacha set a time frame of 3 years to hand over power to an elected civilian government, but he died on Monday, June 8, 1998, under mysterious circumstances. More on that story in our next video.